Hey guys, welcome back. Today I'm going to show you my QT setup and I'm going to give you my tips for quarantining wrasses. Alright, so we are in the basement right now. This is where I have a little QT tank. This is a 10-gallon tank with a hang over the back filter. And right now I'm quarantining two wrasses. The one that's speaking out here is a pintail fairy wrasse. And then this little guy over there, he's hiding, is a carpenter wrasse. I'm going to feed them in a little bit and they're going to come out. So I just want to go over my quarantine process and just show you guys how easy it is. So first, I think it's super important to quarantine. I've learned this the hard way. My first freshwater tank, I had gotten a couple of really nice fish, and I went to my local LFS and I picked up a few more nice fish, and within a week I had freshwater ick everywhere. I had to treat the tank, and in the process of treating the tank, all the fish died, and it was a very useful lesson early on of the importance of quarantining. So my tank has, my display has a lot of really nice fish. It's got a lot of really nice corals, and the last thing that I want to do is add a new fish and end up with a disease outbreak, having to pull apart the tank to try to get a fish out, or having to take my chances with treating in the display where the drugs may kill my corals and invertebrates. I'm going to tell you what I typically do for wrasses because as you know from seeing my channels, I have a sweet spot for wrasses, and they're great fish, lots of personality. They do a great job of doing pest control in your reef tank, and they're beautiful. So, but they're a little bit delicate, and some of them are kind of finicky in terms of eating. Needing specific diets like copepods early on. Some of them most of them are delicate to copper, like they don't tolerate copper very well. So I'm going to show you some of my tips, but first I'm just going to show you the equipment. So this is a really cheap 10-gallon tank. You could pick it up anywhere. It doesn't have to be in a fancy place. You can see it's sitting on the floor of my basement here, and it's got a filter that takes these little pads. I'm going to show you right here. So at any one point, I have 2 or 3 of these hanging around in my sump and in my display tank, getting seeded with bacteria for the nitrogen cycle. So when it's time to add a new fish, what I do is I do a large 10-gallon water change from my display, add the water, the dirty water from my display, into the quarantine tank here, add one of these filters from my sump, and I'm ready to go. And most of the time, I don't have to deal with any problems with ammonia and so on. One thing is for this is made by Aqueon, and inside here there's actually little bits of carbon, which is good for polishing the water. But if you're going to run any chemicals, you don't want the carbon in there. But it's easy enough to just cut a little slit here and remove all the carbon when you start medicating. And I'm going to go over medications in a little bit. All right, what else do I have in here? I just have an air stone just for extra aeration. Here you see a little bag of Seachem matrix. I added that, so I have a big bag of Seachem matrix in my sump, and I added a little bit of the Seachem matrix here, just because I have 2 fishies here. You know, it's a small volume, and I don't want to run into issues of ammonia. So this gives me a little bit more biological filtration. Okay, what else am I using? For the heater, I really love these little heaters from Aqueon. They come preset to 78 Fahrenheit. They're small, and I have a couple of these, and I just put them in the tank, and you don't have to worry about adjusting the temperature. So obviously they suck if you want to change the temperature, but for the most part I never have to mess around with the temperature. 78 works great. The great thing about that is because I actually have two of these, so if you're doing a water change, you could just add one into the pail to make sure that the temperature that you're going to add in is the same as the temperature that you're going to take out. And because they're both set to 78, you don't have to worry about one thermometer, one one heater being a little bit hotter or cooler than the other. All right, other key bits of equipment that I recommend for a quarantine is you want to have some PVC pipes for the fish to hide. And super important is this little badge, ammonia badge that Seachem makes. Highly recommend it. Essentially, if there is any ammonia in here, the circle in here will turn from yellow to green or blue, and it's just way easier to check this every day than to do a typical ammonia test. So I highly recommend this. Okay, so in terms of for wrasses or fish that are what I call kind of like not finicky. So like the fairy wrasses and I think most of the flasher wrasses, the helichorus, like your yellow chorus wrasse, another helichorus would be your melanaris wrasse. You know, they're actually like pretty easy to keep. In terms of like feeding. So I would just essentially set this up. If you're doing a wrasse that requires sand, then I actually add a little bit of sand into here. I just put it straight on the bottom. And you see here I have a bag right beside my quarantine tank. I have a bag of carob sea live sand that if I know that I'm going to get a wrasse that sleeps in the sand, then I add the sand into here. If you're planning to quarantine a leopard wrasse, and leopard wrasse are more finicky because they prefer to eat copepods early on, and they're a little bit delicate. You're going to have to kind of coach them into eating prepared food. If I'm doing a delicate wrasse like that, then what I would do is I would try to, instead of setting the quarantine tank like the day or a couple of days before I get the fish, then what I like to do is actually set up the quarantine tank for a good like week or two, sometimes a little bit longer. And I put way more sand in here. I would take little bits of rubble from my display tank, and I would actually take like a ball of Cheeto from my sump and put it into the quarantine. So the idea is you're trying to seed your quarantine system with as much live amphipods and copepods as possible. So that way, when it's time to add your fish, they're going to have a little bit of food to eat before they start taking fresh food, fresh and frozen. Sorry, frozen, frozen in pellets. So that's what I typically do. So for delicate wrasses and wrasses that are finicky to eat, I put live sand. I get rocks for my display. I add Cheeto just to kind of increase the amount of life in here. For other wrasses that I know I'm not going to have a problem feeding, then I just go with the PVC pipes and that's it. All right, in terms of other things that you're gonna need to have on hand, so you don't have to have all of these products, obviously, but I'm gonna show you things that I find are really useful. Seachem Stability or any product that's like a bacteria in a bottle, that's kind of useful to have when you first set up the tank, just to, again, seed your biofilter and avoid having any ammonia spikes. Now with a small system like this, if you ever get ammonia, then obviously a couple of large water changes are going to solve your problem, but it's still good to have like stability in hand. Here I have Prime, Seachem Prime. I use this if I have a case where I'm getting an ammonia spike in a quarantine system. I can't keep it down with water changes, and I have a couple of fish in the tank that I just need to protect short term until I figure out a solution. So Prime is your friend when you need like a couple of hours before you're able to do something to reduce the ammonia. Now, you can't use Prime if you're medicating because often there is like synergistic interaction that make the medicine way more toxic to fish. So you only use Prime if there isn't any medicine in the tank. All right. In terms of what I do for treating fish, I always have copper. I always have a couple of brands of copper. So here is Coopermine and Copper Safe, and obviously copper is really good for things like velvet and ick. Before my approach was to put the fish in, and then just kind of watch them for a little bit, and then start the copper. But now I'm trying to actually embrace the prophylactic treatment. The problem is when you get a fish that's sick, often, I mean, in most of the cases, you're not going to know what the fish has. I mean, there's a few examples where it's really obvious that you have ick, or it's really obvious that you have velvet, but often you kind of don't know what's happening, uh, and and then you end up like posting pictures online, and so on. And by the time you find the diagnosis, it might be too late, or you might get like an incorrect diagnosis, and so on. So I used to kind of just wait and see, but now, just for my peace of mind, to avoid any of the stress, I try to treat fish with copper right away, so to at least like rule out whether even if I have ick or have velvet. Both of these I bought like saltwater fish that have come with these diseases. So I treat with copper, and then I don't have to worry about it, and I could move to the next step of my quarantine. So one really important thing for treating with copper for wrasses is to bring the dose very slowly. So it takes me 3 to 5 days to actually go from the regular salt water into therapeutic levels of copper. Uh, One very, very important tip that I recommend when using copper is to actually test your levels with an accurate test kit. So I have here the Hana copper checker. This thing is worth its weight in gold. Uh, well, this thing is worth $60. So, but to me, it's really useful because uh, most of the copper kits that are out there on the market right now are they're I mean, I don't want to say awful, but they're very difficult to read, and the difference between like the therapeutic dose and the lethal dose is subtle, to say the least. So copper can kill. Yeah, copper is a poison, and at high enough doses, it will kill fish. So you want to like take the precautions, really good precautions, not to overdose this stuff, but you still want to get the right dose to kill your nasty velvet and egg parasites. So I find that the henna checker just leaves out any of the guesswork, and it's this is $60, but it's a great investment, right? And like some of these wrasses are hundreds of dollars. Not these wrasses, but I've purchased wrasses that were really expensive in the past, and just spending a little bit more money to make sure that you're not gonna kill the $200 wrasse that you just bought by overdosing with copper. To me, that's priceless. So I treat with copper, bring the levels up really slowly, checking every day. Here is actually what I do. I keep notes. So this is this is my records for these two fish, and you see like every few hours I'm adding like 0.2 mil, and I'm recording the total volume of copper that I added, and what's the parts per billion. This is ionic copper, so what I'm shooting for is 1.5, above 1.5, and right now I'm 1.38. All right, so after the copper is done, and sometimes you could leave the fish for a month, or what I do is I treat for copper for 14 days, and the plan is to essentially take these fish, put them in a different tank, so kind of like a tank transfer, and then stop the copper. And again, every fish is going to be different, and people have different ideas and theories about what's the optimum amount of time. But it's generally agreed that for things like 14 days in copper, followed by a transfer into another tank and all new equipment, is generally fine. But if you want to be like totally cautious, then keep the fish in 30 days. All right, afterwards, then what I typically want to do is treat with something like Pro for internal parasites and flukes. I've had a couple of problems with Pro and wrasses in the past, where the wrasses came out of copper doing really well, and then I dosed Protzi, and then they died really quickly. So I stopped using Protzi, and I now dose API General Cure. I do 2 rounds of this. Again, in new water, so you can't mix this with copper. Um, so what I do is I do 2 rounds of these. So the API General Cure has like a diluted dose of Protzi Pro, of Protzi, and it's got an antibiotic, Metroplex, I believe. And then generally, if the fish are happy and looking good after the copper and after the general cure treatment, then I would essentially just fatten them up for another week and then add them to the display. Very important whenever you're adding wrasses to a tank that already has wrasses. I generally like to use an acclimation box, and there's a link on an example of kind of how to use an acclimation box up here. And it's a great way to just gauge whether there's going to be any aggression before the fish are released, and then it's really hard to separate the fish and catch them once you put them in the display. All right, what else? Okay, in terms of food, I generally like to again start the fish feeding with frozen mysis and brine shrimp. If you have some really like tricky fish, then you could always buy brine shrimp eggs and actually hatch them, so you could like feed live food if the fish are finicky. But generally, most wrasses will take frozen. The exception being leopards and tamarin wrasses, where essentially they take a long time to get used to food. I had a really good experience with using what's that food, mastic, that you stick on the glass. So my tamarin wrasse, before he ate frozen or pellets, he really loved the mastic. So it's good to have a variety of foods around on hand, so that way you could try things, and you hope that one of the foods the fish will like. So speaking of food, right now these guys they ate frozen, and I got them trained to eat pellets. This is a fun little product, wild goji from Nios, and it took them the first 2 days they kind of just ignored this altogether, but now they really love it. So here, let's see these beauties eating. So I'm gonna take a few of these soft pellets, put them on top here, and you're gonna kind of notice the excitement. You don't wanna overfeed, and you certainly don't want to overfeed early on. There he goes, and here is the other guy. So the carpenter flasher wrasse and the pintail wrasse. They're beautiful fish. Let's just have a closer look. You don't want to overfeed, especially early on when your biofilter is still kind of building. So I just drop a few pellets here and there. I feed 3 times a day, but not a lot. Literally like a couple of pellets. Maybe later on when a couple of weeks into quarantine. This is essentially week 1 of quarantine for these fish. So maybe by like week 3, week 4, I will up the dosing. But right now, up the feeding. But right now, I'm just sparsely feeding them. I don't want to cause any ammonia spikes. One thing that I do when you have a quarantine system, it's you want to like look at your fish, right? So I spend quite a bit of time here just observing their behavior, making sure that they're behaving normally, they look healthy. I like to take pictures, so if you notice like spots or some damage to the fish, you could go back and kind of determine whether it's new or whether the fish always had it. And when I'm not around, I actually have a little webcam here that I have on the tank. So at work, I could just check on the fish. And yeah, that's my process for quarantine. All of this stuff adds up, right? So the medicines are, they're not expensive, but the medicines add up, the equipment adds up. But at the end of the day, I feel like it's a small price to pay for having the headache of putting a fish right into display and then having that fish infect your tank. So it's worth the investment in terms of protecting the fish and also saving you a lot of time and potentially more money later if you have to treat your display. Okay, guys, before I sign off, I'm gonna put links to Reef's disease forum. I've found it really useful, and a lot of the things that I do now I've learned by listening to the experts and reading some of their articles and following their advice. So Reef fish disease forum is just super awesome. Links are going to be in the video description. And that's it. Hopefully these guys will make it, and I will see you later. Have a good one.